I'm Jennifer and this is Kate, and today we have another great Catholic book find to share with you.
And it is this book, Christ in Dachau by Father John Lenz, which is the story of his long-term imprisonment in the Dachau Concentration Camp during World War II.
So yeah, definitely a tough topic, concentration camps. So this one was hard to read in places, but it was so good. And once we started reading it, we just could not put it down.
It continually surprised us from the start to the finish and made it right onto our Catholic Do Not Miss list. So let's go ahead and jump into the review.
Okay, so as we mentioned in this video, when this book showed up in the mail as the Sophia Institute Press Book of the Month for September, we really were not that excited because it looked pretty intense, concentration camp.
And we even lost this book at church
Accidentally.
And we weren't, too sad to have lost it, but thankfully it did come back to us. And once we started reading it, we realized it was not what we thought at all.
Yes, this book is about Dachau Concentration Camp, but it surprised us, it amazed us, and it definitely showed us what being a true disciple of Christ really looks like.
So we're going to get into all of those different things, but we're going to start first with some of the things that surprised us.
Surprise! It's the parochial vicar. All right, parochial vicar, you need to go pray a rosary. Okay, there you go. Okay, so for starters, we never realized just how many concentration camps there were during the war. So as we're reading, they kept mentioning more and more and more different names. And so we finally looked it up, and it was hard to get a hard and fast number, but I think you could safely say there were between 12 and 20,000 concentration camps during World War II. That is a lot.
We also learned that it wasn't just the guards who made life miserable there. There were specific prisoners called capos who oversaw groups of their fellow prisoners, and they were often just as mean and brutal to them as the guards were, so that was very sad to read about.
We also learned that Dachau was the main concentration camp for priests. That's where you went if you were a priest. We didn't know that. There were over 2,700 priests interred there during the war, everyone from seminarians to bishops. And yet, despite how horrible life was there on a day-to-day basis, Dachau was a very holy place. Many miracles happened there. And as Father Lenz is going through and just recording one miracle after another, he pauses and he says, "This was Christ in Dachau."
There was even a library for the prisoners there, and later on in the war, there was even a chapel where Mass was held every Sunday in multiple different languages. And there was even a beautiful statue of the Blessed Mother there called Our Lady of Dachau.
Yes, so many things surprised us in this book, but the book was also very amazing, so many amazing stories. For instance, Father Lenz tells the story of one of his fellow prisoners that he met up with after the war. They had both survived the concentration camp, and this man had really been through the gamut as a prisoner. He had been beaten, starved, sent to solitary confinement, you name it, it happened to him.
But he told Father Lenz that he had never been as happy as he was when he was in the camp, because he really got to know Jesus there and could see Jesus working all around him. So all of that suffering was a small price to pay.
Yeah, wow. That's all I have to say right there is wow. It's also very amazing that Father Lenz even survived to tell his story, because he also underwent starvation and torture and punishment. But on top of that, that's not enough. On top of that, he contracted typhus and nearly died. He was nursed back to health, but he'd been healthy like 2 weeks, and he came down with a case of appendicitis.
So a Jewish doctor had to operate on him to save his life. So it was very clearly the hand of God working through all of this.
Amazingly, there was even a priestly ordination in Dachau. There was a young German deacon who was ordained to the priesthood by a French bishop. So let's think about that. You had a Catholic priest ordained in a chapel in a concentration camp run by the SS/Nazis. If that's not miraculous, what is?
The book also really shows what it's like to live as a disciple of Christ. For one, the priests were completely selfless. They lived to serve others. An example of this was at the end of the war when Germany was losing. They were struggling to feed all of their prisoners, so they allowed the priests to write home and request food and care packages.
And the folks at home were very generous. They sent food, they sent supplies. So what do the priests do? They all decide that we're just not going to eat any of the food that was sent to us in our very own care packages. We're going to give that food away to other prisoners who need it more. Again, wow.
And these starving priests even gave blood to other prisoners to save their lives. So truly, they were walking in the footsteps of Christ.
Another example, this one shows how when disciples see a need, they fill a need. There were a lot of Russian prisoners in the camp, but no Russian priests. So the Russians had no priest to comfort them or to pray with them or to hear their confessions in their own language. Well, there was another priest, Father Hermann Dumig, a German priest, who was so upset by this, he decided that, well, I'm just going to learn Russian in my spare time.
So he spent many long hours hiding from the SS guards, learning Russian from a Czech priest and an old Polish lawyer. So he then translated parts of the Bible and different prayers, even parts of the Imitation of Christ, all so the Russian prisoners could have them.
Just another day in the life of a disciple, right? Father Lenz also shows what true Christian charity is. He starts off the book by saying, don't hate the people of Dachau. Yes, they had a concentration camp right in their town, and yet they did everything humanly possible to help us and send us aid and comfort into the camp.
He also often describes the terrible actions of the guards and some of the capos, but he very rarely ever names names. He says that these things happen, but right now it's not going to change anything or help anyone if we point out exactly who did them.
So again, this book shows so clearly what it is like to be a disciple of Christ. So it is a fabulous read just for that reason. But I also think that this would make a really good book for teens going through confirmation prep to read. This is what a disciple does.
There was also some crazy stuff in this book that we did not expect. One of those was a fake nun named Sister Pia. She was a lapsed Catholic who would go into the camp and try to talk the prisoners into becoming Nazis. And many of the prisoners just laughed at her, but there's nothing creepy at all about a fake nun, right?
Fake nuns have been around for a long time. At the same time, Father Lenz tells the story of a different nun when he met after the war, and the nun told him that one day an SS officer came into the convent and said, oh, you can worship Christ on this altar now, but soon after the war, you'll be worshiping Adolf Hitler here.
So in her response, she said, if Hitler is prepared to die on the cross for his people and then rise from the dead on the third day, I'll change my habit for a Nazi uniform then, but not before.
You go, sister. So Father Lenz talks all through the book about how helpful the nuns were to them, all the nuns in the different convents around Europe who were helping them and praying for them.
So they prayed, they sent care packages, they even smuggled mass supplies and vestments into the camp at great risk to themselves and to those helping them.
So if you are looking for a book to read that's just wonderful and inspiring on a million different levels, this is it.
So yes, it was difficult to read about all these horrible things, but Father Lenz writes in a way that helps lead you through it. He talks about the bad, but he also every time mentions many of the miraculous things that happened right alongside.
So as we mentioned earlier, once we started reading the book, it was really, really hard to put it down. There was only one thing that was a little bit confusing for us in the book, and that is that Father Lenz jumps a lot around in time. It's not necessarily written in chronological order, so that sometimes we would be going along reading about this prisoner or that priest and then think, wait a minute, wasn't he released in chapter 4 or didn't he die in chapter 6?
So just be aware of that, but once you get used to his writing style, it's not a big deal. And he does provide several timelines to help you get a big picture idea of what happened when.
And speaking of pictures, there are a lot of pictures in the back of the book. For instance, here is a picture of Our Lady of Dachau, and there are also many pictures of the priests who were prisoners there. So that was really cool to be able to read about them and then flip to the back and you could put a face with a name.
So that was our review of Christ in Dachau. Definitely a great book find.
Definitely a do not miss Catholic book.
So let us know down in the comments if you read it and what you thought.
So thank you for watching. We hope the video was helpful. We hope you get a chance to read this one if you haven't, and we will see you next time. Bye.